organizations which are jointly hosting the meeting today. That is the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group, and the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. And although I will say this at the end of the meeting, I'm going to say it now that if any of you listening are not members of those organizations, please make sure that's the first thing you do after you've finished being on this call, that you join up to those organizations. Welcome to viewers on Zoom and on Facebook. The Facebook pages of the three organizations are hosting this event. There is translation available for those who are viewing on Zoom. So if you are watching on Facebook and you want to hear translation, you will have to move to the Zoom call. The link has been posted for the Facebook event page too. So the translation will be available on Zoom. We have 5 fantastic guests today from Cuba, from Nicaragua, from Venezuela, and from Spain. If there is time at the end, we will also be able to put some questions to them. So please do post your questions in the Q&A section. I'm sure everybody's really familiar with Zoom now, so you know how to do that. There was widespread relief from progressive forces across Latin America and in the Caribbean when Donald Trump lost the elections in November. Without doubt, illegal US sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua have intensified over the 4 years of his presidency. The US government funding of regime change activities, internal subversion, and intervention increased across all 3 countries under Trump. And these sanctions and external interference have been deeply damaging to their respective economies, societies, and of course, including damaging to efforts to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. So Joe Biden has now been in the White House for almost a month and is currently forming future White House policy. However, the indications so far are that US policy towards Nicaragua and Venezuela remain one of regime change. And whilst Biden has indicated that he may return to Obama's policy of dialogue and more positive relations with Cuba, this only scratches the surface of the intricate web of legislation and sanctions that make up the US blockade of the island now in its 59th year. Sanctions, of course, are not limited to the US, though. The European Union has taken its own actions in the area. And to speak about this, I'm delighted that our first speaker is Maite Mola, who is the Vice President of the Party of the European Left. So just before we move to Maite and to hear her presentation, I just remind you that there will be translation from Spanish into English if you are watching on Zoom. And if you're on Facebook, now is your opportunity to move over to Zoom so that you can hear it. Maite, we very much look forward to your remarks. The floor is yours.
Bueno, vamos a ver.
Let's see. I practically understood nothing of what has been said. But the communication was very cut off, the translation. I understand very little English, but I understand some. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I want you to know that the Party of the European Left composed of 35 political parties of Europe and beyond only Europe. We have good relations with people in the United Kingdom. There is a party here that we work with. It's good to comment that the Party of the European Left approved in the last Congress a year ago the solidarity with the struggles of Latin America. From more than 12 years, we have a very solid relationship with the Sao Paulo Forum. And we dedicate a very important part of our international policy to the issue of Latin America, where we have taken very clear positions against any type of sanctions, particularly from Europe. And I would like to add that not only in the Latin American area, but also internationally, we have been very critical with the coup d'etat, the two against Zelaya and Honduras in 2009 until the one in Morales of Bolivia in 2019, going through the ones in Paraguay, Brazil, and we were like international observers, both in the international elections in Venezuela and Bolivia. And we have been with Manu Pineda also just now in the last few days with Manu Pineda in Ecuador. And we've been preparing El Salvador and Chile, and we hope also in Ecuador in the second round. We see very dangerous things happening. The truth is, the delegation from Colombia has arrived to Ecuador to try to undermine the winning list, which is with the participation of the Organization of American States as accomplice in order to steal the election. And the concrete thing, yesterday something very important happened. We have this happening in the social networks. The statements that were made on the part of the United Nations rapporteur. I think it's a day which is very important to be registered in history, because the United Nations is very well, but not always makes a statement of this kind with such a categorical nature as the one yesterday about the situation, the concrete situation of the sanctions against Venezuela. So we would like to see the whole statement, because it's very long. We have to defend them everywhere. But it's the most important aspects which concentrates the declaration. That it's good that it's not always the left that actually makes the statements like this. Let's say neutral people that actually make the statement on this thing of the extreme poverty, of the children, of the workers, of the doctors, and women doctors, and people with disabilities, and people with chronic illness. In Venezuela, this rapporteur really has done a good summary that I would have liked to have done myself. Very progressive statement. But for all of those who are here now, this is something we haven't seen for a long time. This is good for Venezuela, Nicaragua, for Cuba, and many other countries, if I can allow to add, that are under the sanction regime, that now we have the statement that we can use. Well, concentrating, focusing on our issue today about Venezuela. This statement has a 90% application to Venezuela. So people who are defending, like ourselves, the right to health, the right to education, the right to a dignified life. We are with this rapporteur that we've been saying this for many years. And this is something that we consider that it's great that it's not exactly us who are saying this. I also want to add that not only the United States that actually apply sanctions, it's also the European Union who are applying blockades, these sanctions, these indignities against the peoples. But we shouldn't forget that it's also Canada, which we think is a wonderful place. It's a happy Tachihuay, as we say in Spain, which is a supposed defender of ecology. But when it comes to it, is one of the countries that is centrally involved in the application of these sanctions against Venezuela and other countries. So I don't know how much I have left. I want to very briefly say that what we have to do in the case of Venezuela against the sanctions is to return the monies illegally retained of Venezuela, because it's not very nice that the money of one people is retained, the United Kingdom, Portugal, and many other countries. This is retained absolutely illegally, and then, you know, they are making money out of this. They're taking profits out of it. So this money, they're making big benefits out of it. And the economic issue in Venezuela, which let me be so sharp about this. We have to return this money, whether we are in pandemic or whether we are not in pandemic, because, you know, we're talking about a situation which in Venezuela, also Cuba, also Venezuela, and Nicaragua is terrible against Venezuela, which is taking place for a long time. So let's not confuse that because of the pandemic we are demanding it. We should demand it anyway. The main problem is the United States. But we also know the European Union, above all, in the case of Cuba, it allies with the United States. But in the case against Venezuela, it allies with the United States. In the case of Cuba, has a different position. That we are in Spain with the government of the Socialist Party, but and since we are internationalists, it's very curious that our Minister of Foreign Ministry has requested Biden that, you know, it allows us to release some funds, which is not everything, but at least it's something. Because Spain has a lot of interest in Cuba, which are very important for the economic interest in Spain regarding the situation in Cuba. With the case of Nicaragua, I would like to say a couple of things. It seems to me that the whole of the European loop,
Maite, un minuto, por favor.
They have a neo-colonial view on Nicaragua. But I don't want to not use that minute for Nicaragua. It cannot be that that neo-colonial view that the European Union has, or the United States, or anybody on Nicaragua, is got to be in the governments. And also, neither the European Union, nor United States, nobody has the right to sanction any country in the world. Only the United Nations has the right. All the unilateral coercive measures are illegal. And I finish with that. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Maite. Thank you very much, Maite, for that intervention. Very well timed as well. We move now to our next contribution, which is from Nicaragua. Following the failure of the US financed coup in 2018, the US administration under Trump pushed ahead with economic and psychological warfare against the Nicaraguan people and imposed a raft of sanctions designed to put paid to Nicaragua's investment in the pro-poor policies, which have over the last 14 years led to radical transformations in Nicaraguan society. As recently as May last year, with the pandemic raging, the US saw fit to impose even more sanctions on Nicaragua. With Nicaraguan elections due in November this year, it's highly unlikely that we will see any change of policy under Joe Biden. And unfortunately, the European Union and the British government are also engaging in the US sanctions regime. So we are delighted to have with us today from Nicaragua to tell us more about the real situation there. We have Coleen Littlejohn, an international development worker who has been based in Nicaragua for 41 years. So Coleen, the floor is yours. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. And good morning to all from Managua, which has been my home base for 41 years and where every 4 years I follow the US presidential elections and hope that something will change with respect to US foreign policy towards this incredible country. But it's hard to break traditions of over 160 years ago when William Walker first invaded Nicaragua to try and annex the country as a slave state to the US prior to the Civil War. Recently, President Biden's team announced their priorities for Central America, concentrating on the Northern Triangle, countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, in order to address severe problems of corruption, poverty, and violence, and to stop people from fleeing to the north. Fortunately, Nicaragua doesn't really qualify for those type of programs. Nicaraguans don't join the marches to the States via Mexico. She has the lowest homicide rate in Central America. No gangs or cartels are running the country. And multilateral funders, without exception, have respected the transparent management and the results of their loan portfolios. Poverty rates have decreased considerably, and the country is ranked 5th in gender equity worldwide. Nevertheless, right before he left office, Donald Trump renewed the sanctions against the country, stating that Nicaragua remained an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. And of course, the UK and the European followed suit. Sanctions include financial and travel sanctions against many top officials of the government, but these really have little or no personal impact. But it has meant changes in public administration to make sure that specific ministries, their financial transactions are not jeopardized. These sanctions also may have created uncertainty internationally with banks and potential investors, but it didn't stop the US investors who are now building a huge national natural gas plant at the port of Corinto, which will help to decrease the use of imported petroleum. And as a side note, last month, 88% of Nicaragua energy came from renewable sources, and 98.5% of the population has electricity now, a big advance from 14 years ago. Individuals and organizations working on development projects have been affected, though. For example, a community-based NGO that I know who was receiving ALBA funds for social projects lost their bank account. A lot of trade unions have lost their bank account, cooperatives, and people are having problems. But there was a new law passed last week that for consumer rights that may help this situation. But the most serious aggression was the approval of the Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act, also known as the NICA Act, in December of 2008. Its purpose was to block the country from development financing from the major multilaterals, although pro-poor projects were supposed to be exempt. But even before the law was passed, the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank basically froze their programs under pressure from the United States and supported by Europe. IDB's last major loans were approved in December of 2017, and although they continued with a series of small approvals, rarely over $500,000, it wasn't until this past December that they passed some decent programs. The World Bank approved a new country strategy in March of 2018, along with the approval of 3 large projects, but then nothing until December of last year, and again now this past January. And the World Bank, most importantly, though, I think these multilateral agencies did not include Nicaragua in their initial emergency responses for the COVID pandemic, which meant that the Nicaraguan government had to deal with these issues with their general budget. Fortunately, about 60% of that budget goes to health and education, and over the past 16 years, investments in new hospitals and clinics strengthened the already well-developed community-based free health system. But there were shortages of medicines, there were shortages of tests, equipment, and personal protective equipment well into 2020. Nevertheless, Nicaragua's strategic early response to the pandemic, using her own resources, has resulted in the lowest number of infections and deaths and the highest recovery rate in the region, while keeping all its borders open under rigorous safety protocols. Although if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, you would think that we were living in a hell right now, but fake news. Nicaragua was also not included in the initial multilateral emergency projects for the hurricanes Eta and Iota, which were the most devastating to hit the country in over 40 years. But the government's very seasoned and efficient national system of disaster prevention and mitigation was activated a week before the first hurricane hit. 100,000 emergency volunteers mobilized, 160,000 people evacuated, shelters established and supplied days earlier. No deaths were attributed to the first hurricane. 16 died in the second, unfortunately, because they were people who just didn't want to leave their homes or went back against advice. But it was not until last December and this past January that the World Bank and the IDB made more serious commitments to pandemic and hurricane relief. There is an exception, though. The Central America Integration Bank has been this exception, accompanying Nicaragua in the last few years with significant support, and now even more so in order to reactivate the economy and ensure that the region is provided with COVID vaccines. The responses have been in coordination with SICA, the Central Integration System, which has been the economic and political organization of Central American states since February of 1993.
Coleen, 1 minute, please. 1 minute. Thank you.
Seriously. Oh my God. Okay. Anyway, there's been no shortage of funds. I think maybe then my biggest comment now would be to say that there's been no shortage of U.S. funds for the people and the organizations who directed the terror campaign in April of 2018. Over $102 million has been given to these organizations and leaders of the opposition since 2017. And I did also want to remind people that Nicaragua has been following and been very faithful to international justice in the sense of going to the International Court of The Hague. They won in 1984. The United States never paid up. They refused to recognize the court's decision. I'd like to end up summing a statement recently made by Nicaragua's foreign minister. He expressed the need to promote a green alliance between developed and countries that are trying to develop in order to face the combined consequences of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. The world urgently needs peace, security, stability, and a new economic order which gives priority to life, health, and the fight against poverty. We need a responsible and just world with mutual cooperation where there is no room for unilateral, coercive, arbitrary, and illegal measures, which some call sanctions, but that the people of the world called aggressions, violations of international law and the Charter of the United States. Sanctions not only jeopardize ordinary people's lives, but they constitute a violation of their human rights. And in the current context of the pandemic, sanctions are tantamount to crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Coleen, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I cut you a bit short there, but we do want to try and get in some questions as well. Okay, we move to Venezuela now. And although the Trump administration introduced many new sanctions against Venezuela, it's important to remember that it was indeed the Democratic President Obama who was responsible for implementing many of these sanctions in the first place. There is no sign from Biden that the administration will end these during his presidency. The US sanctions against Venezuela, as I'm sure we all know, are in violation of international law under the United Nations Charter, the Organization of the American States Charter, and even US law. They were responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in Venezuela, even before the coronavirus outbreak, and more so now. The EU and Britain have followed the US lead by preventing Venezuela, and we heard this earlier from Maite, accessing funds which could help its people during this time. People on this call will be aware that the Bank of England is still refusing to release £1.3 billion worth of gold belonging to Venezuela. So to tell us more about the situation in Venezuela, we are delighted to welcome Carlos Ron, President of the Simón Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity among peoples in Venezuela. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and saludos a todos y todas también. I was asked to speak in English, so here we go. Thank you for this invitation. And look, I think we have to start by saying, you know, I appreciated Maite's introduction because I think what we saw yesterday here in Caracas with the Special Rapporteur's report is really, you know, it was really something important, transcendental in this struggle against the so-called sanctions. This morning I was reading one of our journalists from Venezuela, Erika Ortega Sanoja, who said that you know, she felt sorry. She sort of broke up a little bit yesterday when the reading was being made of the report by the rapporteur, and she says, I'm sorry because I am a journalist, but when you hear the list of aggressions and things that have been done against your country, it's kind of hard as a Venezuelan not to be taken, back by these issues. And that's sort of what I think is the feeling today here. The first thing we have to discuss, and I think it's very important, is that this issue is first and foremost an issue against international law. These so-called sanctions are, this is an issue about law. When I approach this and when we talk about this, I'm not asking you to be sympathetic to the Venezuelan government. I'm not asking you to be socialist. I'm not asking you to pass any judgment, positive or negative, on what we are doing in Venezuela or in any of these other countries that are being attacked. I am asking you to see how this is a violation of international law. This is a question that needs to be brought up every time, because first of all we commit we're guilty of saying sanctions and it sort of implies that there is something that was done wrong by any of these countries, and at the end of the day, these are all illegal unilateral coercive measures by one state or by a group of some states following that state's lead against a whole populations. This is a form of collective punishment, which is in itself a crime against humanity, because when these measures are implemented, they impact equally everybody living in those countries. And I'm speaking about Venezuela in particular, but I know this applies to all the other countries, like Maite signalized before. It applies equally to all. So this is something we have to take out of our narrative, of the way we speak. These are illegal measures. Minister Zarif from Iran once called it economic terrorism. And that's actually more appropriate, a much more appropriate term than when we use sanctions. As a matter of fact, one of the things that was interesting to see yesterday is that the response from the United States, when all these denunciations came about and were sort of summed up in the rapporteur's initial report, well, they have no defense. They don't address the issue of legality because they know these are illegal, and they try to mask their response and to excuse themselves by saying, well, trying to place the blame and conditions prior to the sanctions or anything of the sort. But again, if they're saying the problem is that the country has a bad situation, a bad economic situation, a bad political situation, whatever it is, then you punish it by making it worse, by making it exceedingly worse. I'm going to read just a little bit. I know we have very little time, so I'll try to be quick, but I want to read, and I'm sorry for the interpreters. I think that they suffer with the speed. But it's important to see, the special rapporteur included in her statement one sentence that I think is important. It says, the announced purpose of the maximum pressure campaign to change the government of Venezuela violates the principle of sovereign equality of states and constitutes an intervention in domestic affairs of Venezuela that also affects its regional relations. This is the issue. These are measures taken to change the government in Venezuela, to bring about a transition, a political change, an insurrection, whatever it is. And this has nothing to do with any sort of legality. And we have to address this, every time we talk about this issue. What are the impacts of the sanctions? I think, like Coleen said, you have these sanctions that even when they are applied, they're saying, well, these are not to harm the people. These are sanctions that are only aimed at specific persons in the government that are guilty of, corruption or human rights violation, whatever they want to promote. But the thing is that when you hit these people, ministers, the president of the central bank, you start blocking the opportunity of the country to having relations to other people, because no one that has a business or that has even that provides medicine or any of the sort wants to have any relation to anybody that is on a list of people that you could later be punished for having met with them. So this is a very important issue. there's also the issue of overcompliance. This means that beyond what is written on paper, you have institutions, because of the fear of what the United States can do to them, you have institutions taking extra steps to implement these measures. Again, a brief quote, but this is recognized even by people in the US government. There was a letter written on February 11, just 2 days ago, led by Ilhan Omar, but many other members of Congress. And it says, unquote, existing protocols and licenses have proved woefully insufficient to meet the enormity of the challenges shared by people around the world in the face of the pandemic. Even when licenses and humanitarian exemptions are available, moreover, there is a persistent problem of overcompliance, particularly from the financial sector. This has led to catastrophic humanitarian consequences in various parts of the world. And I'm sorry to be quoting, but the thing is that it is important because this is the US, these are people in the US government speaking, not me. This isn't me just because I'm a Venezuelan and because I'm defending my position. No, this is exactly what is discussed in the US government. So these are the things that we have to address. This is a criminal attack, all-out attack on the populations of our country. Venezuela has been blocked. You know, we have lost in the last year since the Trump administration about 99% of our income, and this has disastrous effects on the entire population. I think one of the other issues that came up yesterday during the report, which I think was important also, is to see that a lot of the programs that we were trying to implement before to, to reverse the inequality that has been traditionally a challenge in Latin America because of our colonial tradition, the neoliberal experiment that ravaged our economies. Well, we try to implement a series of important social programs, and all of these now, and I'm running out. Okay.
Yeah. 1 minute. Okay.
I'll come to an end.
Thank you.
Okay. When we ask questions, keep in mind, and these are law, and we have to ask who gets benefit world answers to be taken. Well, these are people that are now getting benefited themselves by their implementation. At the end of the day,
Carlos, I think I think I may have lost you. I did hear the vast majority of that presentation, and it was extremely persuasive about the need for us to be taking action about the situation in Venezuela. Thank you very much for that, Carlos. I hope you can come back during the questions section. Colleagues, we're now going to move to Cuba. On the 11th of January, just a few days before President Biden's inauguration, the outgoing Trump administration made the shameless decision to return Cuba to its, quote, state sponsors of terrorism list. The policy makes it harder for Biden to reverse the 200 measures that Trump took against Cuba during his administration. And last year, the annual cost of the blockade surpassed more than $5 billion in a single year for the first time in its 60-year history. So it's doubly inspiring that during that time, Cuba still managed to send 4,000 medics to 4 countries to help fight COVID-19, despite suffering the impact of the pandemic at home. So I am genuinely delighted to welcome our Cuban speaker, who is the Cuban ambassador to the UK, Her Excellency Bárbara Elena Montalvo Álvarez. Bárbara, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, organizer, for the opportunity to share with friends from Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba this afternoon. You know, the vote on the Cuban resolution calling for an end to the blockade of the United States against our country will take place in the session 75 of the UN General Assembly, May 2021. So I'm going to present a summary of the action taken by Donald Trump administration to intensify the blockade, subvert the internal order, create an image of instability in Cuba, and overthrow the revolution. Trump administration applied 242 measures, an unprecedented number, and 136 of them of extraterritorial nature. Enforced Title III of the Helms-Burton after 23 years of consecutive suspensions by the previous administrations. The travel industry was a permanent target of attacks, and as you probably know, tourism is one of the main sources of income for Cuba. Warnings were issued for alleged health incidents to discourage tourism, cruise travel ban, suspension of people-to-people educational trips, modification of 2 of the licenses that would allow visits by US citizens to Cuba, and created a list of prohibited accommodations in Cuba, which included 422 hotels and private rental houses. All regular and charter flights to the entire country were canceled, except for Havana. The number of remittances was limited, and transaction from the third countries through Western Union were prohibited. They directly attacked Cuba's international medical cooperation, and the Commerce and Treasury departments resumed the import ban on any product from any country that contains more than 10% of US components. The State Department created the list of restricted Cuban entities with which persons subject to US jurisdiction are prohibited from conducting financial transactions. To give you a better idea, 231 Cuban companies are registered on that list. Meticulous and permanent persecution of the banking financial operations of Cuba was conducted. The closing of bank accounts and the denial of transactions with diplomatic and business representations of Cuba abroad increased. Parallel to the strategy against Venezuela, and under the pretext of Cuba alleged interference in the internal affairs of that country, measures were taken against ships, shipping companies, insurance, reinsurance companies linked to the transportation of fuel. And in 2019, 73 vessels and 27 companies were penalized. And of course, these measures affect full supply to our country. Trump's administration did not listen to any of the various demands made to relax the blockade in the face of the pandemic. Quite the opposite. It prevented the access of any supplies. For example, special rapporteurs and experts of the Council of the Human Rights requested Trump's administration to relax the measures considering the effect of the pandemic. They have stressed that the blockade makes humanitarian response difficult to COVID and seriously affect international cooperation to curb the epidemic, treat the patients, and save life. The export and re-export of goods to Cuba implies a complex and costly licensing process because the issuances of licenses or authorization of exemptions can take several months, and in fact has not simplified or modified any of these procedures. Finally, they underline that since the beginning of the pandemic, the impact of the blockade has imposed an additional financial burden, increasing transportation times because Cuba cannot directly obtain supplies, reagents, medical equipment, any drugs from the United States. The Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, Oxfam, has affirmed that the blockade is a policy of unilateral measures that limit the development of the Cuban economy and the livelihood of the Cuban people. From April 2019 to March 2020, and for the first time, as Kristen said, the total amount of damages caused by this policy in 1 year exceeded $5 billion, a fatal record. The persecution of Cuba's operations in third countries causes a high dissuasive and intimidating effect for foreign counterparts. The blockade affects the implementation of important national health programs, such as maternal and child care, and many others, among many others. And it has happened in the past. Anyone can make a claim and collect money from Cuban funds frozen in USA, which cannot be transferred to Cuba due to the blockade, and even from the operations authorized by a license, for example. The blockade is also the main impediment to a better flow information and wider access to the internet by Cubans, making connectivity difficult and more expensive in the country, conditioning access to platforms and technologies, and to use cyberspace to try to subvert the Cuban political and legal system. Cuba was included in the arbitrary and unilateral lists which contravene international law. And the last one is the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Its goal is to defend Cuba and undermine any possibility of recomposition of bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States with the presence of a new administration. Cuba is a state victim of terrorism, including state terrorism committed by the US government or by individuals and organizations that reside or operate in the USA with total impunity and with the tolerance to the authorities of that country. These measures have received rejection internationally and from many sectors within the United States, including prominent members of Congress and Senate, religious organizations, also some international organizations, and includes Association of Cuban living abroad. Likewise, many people in the world who are not familiar with Cuba could refuse to do commercial activities with us due to the inclusion in this list, on this list. I'm not going to overwhelm you with data. This information is public, available, even from sources different from Cuba. I would like to highlight that at the same time, Trump's administration tried to apply a soft coup by instigating the subversion in internal affairs order in a desperate attempt to defeat the revolution. The soft coup scenario against Cuba remained active, and the non-conventional war is being tried in the most diverse battlegrounds. 50 years ago, Kennedy signed the proclamation that started the blockade. It is time to leave it. It is failed cold policy that the international community rejects and condemns, but the blockade caused damage. The international community accompany us in this claim, and friends of Cuba all over the world support us in this claim. Data is not needed to understand how the blockade affects the daily life of each Cuban family. However, I finish saying, while it lasts, we will resist because, as Fidel said, we will face the necessary risks as long as needed. We will face the necessary sacrifices as long as needed, because we take full responsibility for our conduct, for our history, and for our revolution. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Your Excellency. Thank you very much indeed, and solidarity to Cuba. Let me just say that before we move on to our final speaker, we have been getting some questions coming in, and we will take some of them. So make sure if you've got a question, put it in now. I'm just going to say at this point, though, that there is a question from someone about the health situation with COVID must be very bad. And the question is, how can Unison branches and other trade unions help send materials such as PPE, and will sanctions block such aid? Let me just say that that's a question that's best posed to the solidarity campaigns, all of the solidarity campaigns. You can see the details of how to get in touch with them today. So if you would like your union branch to engage in some activity of that kind, do get in touch with the solidarity campaigns. So now we move to our final speaker, who is Manu Pineda. He is a Spanish United Left MEP in the European Union. He will be speaking in Spanish, so make sure that you're on the right channel if you wish to hear him. Okay, Manu, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, dear comrades. In the first place, for having organized this event of solidarity with the countries under aggression from the United States, is this form of dirty war which the sanctions represent. And there are other forms such as lawfare, which is substituting what in the past used to be tanks or other form of aggression, and to try to destroy their sovereignty. I want to thank especially because I can see my teacher and also Maite and also Carlos Ron. I'm going to concentrate at the request of the organizers. I want to focus more European, because there are people who are putting forward the positions of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So I'm going to concentrate on what the European Union is doing now and the new mechanism that they're applying, and they intend to apply and to set in march in the next months. This is a tool of the European Union to interfere against the sovereignty of the peoples. The first is important to remember that the capacity or the only institution that can impose sanctions at the level international is in the National Security Council of the United Nations. The sanctions on top of in the middle of a pandemic and even worse. The Council of the United Nations already expressed its concern about this, of these unilateral coercive measures. And many have requested that these sanctions are, well, lifted or alleviated, so that people can buy and countries can buy disinfectants, soap, ventilators, and other important health input. The European Union, the common policy of security common in the European Union, this been applying measures of these sometime. In this way, we have come to the position in which the European Union represents 36% of the sanctions against, being the European Parliament a very important instrument in this. I want to concentrate the European Parliament and reiterated opportunities has applied sanctions of every kind, despite, as we know, the legality of the sanctions are not clear. In March 2019, almost 2 years ago, approved a resolution supporting resolutions of the European Union and the European Council as the foreign minister of the member states, as part of the European Union, And now Josep Borrell, before Mogherini, continued to apply sanctions against the countries. And finally, in the framework of these sanctions of the European Union, at the end of this, maybe some of the others, some people call law Magnitskyism. However, the right-wing groups and extreme right groups in the European Parliament are applying this, using this sanction. In the 2012, the United States used against one particular individual who was responsible for the assassination of Loy Magnitsky, and this authorizes the European Union to apply unilaterally to apply that because they violate human rights and they apply sanctions. This regime, which exists now in the European Union, we can say, in theory, that the supposedly never persecutes individuals or entities that are responsible of human violations. The people and entities that support financially and all of those who are in this list, in the Magnitsky list, the sanctions will consist in the possibility to travel and in the confiscation of resources. And this applies to individuals as well as entities. And the European Union refuses to lend economic and financial support to these institutions. The kind of sanctions that are applied are for crimes such as genocide and violation of human rights. These apply to the destruction of individuals and also generalized abuses and systematics that may be of the concern of the foreign policy of the European Union. Who are included in this list? These are part of the decisions of the European Union foreign policy. This final list should be approved by unanimity by the European Union, the whole of the process, including the whole process, that it cannot be the application of sanctions will be the competence. There is no independent organization, either civil society or the European Parliament, that actually participate in making this decision. So there are no objective criteria to make decisions today. What are the negative points? In the first place, on the one hand, it is a mechanism that certainly will be used as a new tool of interference against these countries, weaponizing, in this case, the foreign policy of the European Union in the form of sanctions. There is no form of deciding objectively regarding the application of sanctions, which in the case of the violation of human rights of friendly countries, then the European Union has one line, and when it comes to other countries, the European Union has a different line. Many times, this information is obtained through intelligence services, which determine the sanctions that the European Union applies. So these selective sanctions are determined. We know that the selective sanctions are applied to certain countries only. For us, it's a question of principle that we are against this future regime of sanctions of the European Union. In the next months, probably, we'll have to debate about this question in the European Union. But at this particular point in time, this is not easy for us. We have to understand that the extreme right wing and the right wing are very powerful and very strong. They have hegemony. Despite not having numerical evidence, they have enormous influence in the European Parliament, and this is important that is known. Right now, a representative of the extreme right wing, the reformists, FRF, and the values, the democratic identity, and the reformists and conservative Europeans, as well as the People's Popular Party of Europe, they're all, we have members of the extreme right, three very powerful parliamentary groups. And we have been witness of debates that even sections of progressive sections of society are assuming, are taking out the hatred, the discourse of hatred of the right wing, and they are coming closer to the extreme right wing, and this is what determines the foreign policy of the European policy. And the European Union is getting closer and closer to Fortress Europe, which applies sanctions and deportations to people who are running away from various countries where there have been conflict. And this is a scandal that that this is scandalous regarding the question of human rights. And we continue to raise it in the European Parliament. But the most scandalous case that of the capitulation and the intimidation of progressive positions in where the European Parliament took a decision that made the same, equated fascism and communism. We have this type of debates in the European Parliament, that because of that type of debate, and this is part of the competence of the European Union. The relation of forces in the European Parliament is pretty bad. And to this, we must add that we have to add that the European Union policy is just cocktails the foreign policy of the United States. And we have, Josep Borrell, which expresses this view. We want the European Union to abandon its subordination. We want the European Union to abandon its subordination to the foreign policy of the United States and adopt an independent policy. We want the European Union that, they should stop this. That unfortunately, this subordination will continue to be used by the European Union to attack progressive governments around the world. And they never apply these sanctions against the Colombian government or other governments where violations, human relations are rife. Only the Security Council of the United Nations has the authority to apply sanctions. Nobody else does.
Okay, can you wrap up now, please?
This new policy must be terminated. Let me. This policy of the European Union is going to add to the sanctions policy of the United States, and this is going to make things much worse. Not only with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, but also even stopping the remittances of monies from the United States to Cuba. And now the country in Venezuela is receiving 1% of what used to get, 2 years ago. This is also the same with Nicaragua. The sanctions of the European nations are going to be on the table for discussion in the European Parliament and in the institution of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Manu, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we can move on to questions.
I finished sending a very strong hug and warm welcome to and salutations to everybody that is part of the meeting, both in the panel as well as those who are listening.
Thank you. Thank you for the conclusion of that translation. Thank you. We have got some questions that have come in. I just remind you that there was a question about how Unison or other branches, other trade unions can support and send solidarity material and equipment. And the way to deal with that is to go through the solidarity campaigns based here, all of which has been posted in the chat. And I just remind you that lots and lots and lots of actions that you can take are also being posted in the chat. So I do encourage you to do that. I'm going to take, I've got a couple of questions and I'm going to go in this order. First to Coleen Littlejohn, second to Her Excellency Bárbara Elena Montalvo Álvarez, and third to Carlos Ron to answer these questions. It's a question from Brandon about what punishments would the United States get if they continue these sanctions? I think we know the answer to that, but please do comment on that. There's another question about whether you see any indication that the US administration will remove any of the sanctions or take Cuba off the list. And the third question is whether what message you panelists would like to send to President Biden. So, Coleen, if you have any responses on those particular questions, that would be great. About 2 minutes, if you can, please.
Okay. Basically, I've been thinking, you know, the United States has sanctions on 39 countries in the world, including some of the poorest. The United States is not the UN, so at some point there has to be more respect for international law, and all the movements around the world have to start demanding our countries to be more responsible. The punishments, for example, we saw in 1984 that you know, the United States lost a court case in the International Court of Justice. They lost. They wouldn't even go to the part where they had to say how much they owed, which was basically Nicaragua calculated this at $17 billion. And this was only for the first 4 years of the war that the United States financed against Nicaragua. So who's going to punish them? The International Court of Justice, the United States has sanctioned some of those people. So I think we as people have to realize, and I think that there's a lot of activity going on right now in the United States. Sanctions Killl, the Black Lives Matter. People are realizing as a result of the pandemic just how that system needs to be changed. I basically think the countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, as far as social programs, etc., working for the poor, the threat of a good example. You know, people, the right comes on to Nicaragua that there was a Nicaraguan epidemiologist in Ireland saying that, you know, by May we would have 25,000 dead from COVID. This is probably one of the safest countries in the world to be right now as far as COVID. It's controlled because of the health system. Yeah, and a friend of mine's on too, wanting to know about, you know, do I think the head of AID will change? You know, I would hope so, but I don't think so because she doesn't make the policies. You know, we just there has to be some type of movement to say, U.S., you are not, European Union, you are not the UN. Let's get an international system working where the majority of the people are represented.
I'm ready. It's okay.
Respect for international law is not very high up the US agenda, as we well know. Thank you very much for those remarks. Do you want to say a one-sentence message to Biden?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Come down and visit. Come and see what the United States has been trying to destroy for the last 40 years.
Excellent message.
I went in 1981. It's not the same country. It's so, yeah, come and.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent message. Okay. Madam Ambassador, I'm going to come to you, but there's an additional question for you, as well as those questions I put at the beginning, which is, does the US blockade restrict the use of the successful Cuban vaccine against COVID? Is there a specific problem in relation to the blockade with the vaccine? Yeah. So,
wow.
Madam Ambassador.
So many questions. First of all, I'm the Cuban ambassador, so I have any message to the Biden administration. You know, Cuba is ready to any scenario, and you know our historical position. We are in a capability to share and to discuss any problem, and this is an historic position. It's not our problem, but I think that the history will give to those who impose sanction the punishment. I have nothing more to say. And there is an interesting news that I want to share with you. Last Wednesday, a group of 56 organizations, including law and human rights groups, religious organizations, Cuban American groups, environmental and academic organization, business groups, sent a letter to Biden administration urging it to take immediate action to fulfill campaign promise to reverse Trump's failed policies, which continue to inflict harm of Cuban families. And they affirm, these people affirm, that it's in the interest of the United States and in the interest of the Cuban people to move rapidly toward a more normal relationship and urge Congress to take legislative action to end the restriction and to move toward to a complete end of the U.S. embargo, as they said. For us, it's a blockade. So I think this is an interesting aspect. And finally, about the impact of the blockade into a specific item of the vaccine. Well, we need, for example, we are trying to, if you have problem to buy anything, well, it's a reflex. For example, something so simple as a jab is the la jeringuilla, syringe. Sorry, syringe. We don't have enough, and all people who are related with the solidarity with Cuba know how difficult it is to put in Cuba a simple box of medicines. So yes, don't affect the support of the government, the action of our scientists, the passion of our people, the capability to produce a vaccine, because we produce the human experience in Cuba, Cuban experience. Cuba research and produce vaccines. So we are in this path without any doubt. But yes, there is an impact. How many syringes we need to the trials? 1, 2nd, 3rd. And you need to, later, when we obtain the vaccines, we are sure that you obtain. To guarantee a whole population was vaccinated. That's what I can say. And I'm sorry.
No, that's a very clear exposition and response. Thank you very much. Okay, we come now to Carlos. We lost you a little bit right at the end of your initial presentation, but I think you got those questions, didn't you? The ones that I asked. So can you tell us how you respond to those things?
I think I agree with our other panelists in this issue. I mean, I think our biggest struggle and hope is that international law is finally respected on these issues. That's why we in Venezuela have brought a case at the International Criminal Court against the people that perpetrated these cited these sanctions and measures and so forth. And hopefully, we believe in international law, so we want to see some actions come out of that. But I think also it is important, all actions that can be taken to address public opinion, both in the United States and in the other countries in Europe and elsewhere that are also join into this the use of these measures. We have to keep this conversation going. We have to keep these denunciations push for a change of policy within their own countries. With regards to a message, I think that as the Simón Bolívar Institute, being an institute for peace and solidarity, our main message to the new administration really is to go back to diplomacy, to go back to not miss the opportunity, the historic opportunity of making a change in that policy, and to engage in diplomacy so we can talk about differences, work them out in other ways that don't affect entire populations. I think Otherwise, it will be just a deepening and a continuation of the criminal agenda that Trump implemented, and that others before him have similarly implemented on other countries. So take this opportunity, I would say, take this opportunity to approach things with diplomacy and dialogue, rather than make millions of people suffer.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think of the questions that have been sent directly to me, I've covered most of those. So what I'm going to propose is, now that we offer the floor back to all of our speakers to make a couple of minutes of summing up on any of the things that you feel you would like to say, and I will take people in this order. We will take Maite first, and then Manu. So take those speakers first, the colleagues we haven't heard from, and then we will come back to the colleagues on the screen, and I will say in which order. Okay, so Maite, 2 minutes of summing up from you, if you would like to.
I believe Maite had to leave for another engagement where she's also defending the policy on sanctions. So.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, have we got Manu still with us? I'm not sure that we have. Okay. Well, if we haven't, that's fine. I'm going to go back to our colleagues whom we can hear from directly in country. So, Coleen, I cut you off. Right. I've got another question that's come up. The kind of last question that you can maybe address within your summing up is the question that's come in is, how do you think the Biden administration will be different from the Trump administration? So can we go back can we come to perhaps Carlos first on that? Do you see any difference in the Biden administration to the Trump administration?
I think I'd rather let the Biden administration start speaking for itself with their own actions. I know it's recent, only been there a couple of days, and also because that we all know there's a lot of internal problems that the United States also, of course, needs to address. I mean, we're talking about a country that's undergoing an impeachment trial for a former president at this time, and other things. So I think it would not be wise to predict. I don't want to make predictions. I want to see actions. I want to see the real way they implement policies and judgment on that, because the problem that is sometimes with the United States, we have seen that there may be very nice messages and speeches and ideas, but that doesn't actually translate into policies that are actually doing the benefit for our people. Like I mentioned yesterday, the response of the United States to the rapporteur's summary of our visit was, trying to place blame everywhere else but on the United States, which is actually putting implementing these actions. So I think it's best to wait for the actual actions that take place, and again, they have an opportunity. And I know from Venezuela, if there's willingness to talk and to employ diplomacy, there will be a receptiveness of Venezuela. If on the other side there's an attempt to harden these measures to attack further the Venezuelan people, well, we'll also be on our spots to defend our country and keep struggling.
Thanks, Carlos. I think this will be a consistent message across all of our speakers. But Coleen, a last intervention from you on that difference, but also anything else you want to conclude on. Unmute.
I guess, people make judgments on what they think is going on, what they hear. And I think one of the most difficult things is this whole question of the fake news. You see something coming out in the Washington Post, and then it changes a few letters, and it's in the New York Times, it's in the Guardian. Journalism, is they're more stars than real journalists anymore. So we need the people in the United States and Europe need to understand really what is happening. So we have to break fake news thing, and then it's also a little bit of. It's interesting what's happening in the United States now with some people in the House and the Senate. There's, the call for end of sanctions of certain individuals. And so the whole question of lobbying of people to try and influence them to actually see what is happening in these countries, that actually the people in the United States could really benefit from some of the policies, the community policing policy in the United States, the whole in Nicaragua, for example, the question of the health system. Why have a public health system when most of the developed countries in the world do have it? And why is the situation in COVID much more under control here than in California or in Europe even? So how to break the barriers of the lies that are constantly being repeated. And so that's one of the things that we really need to work with and get to some of the people in the administration, as I said, study what is really happening and why is it? I mean, Jimmy Carter said, a few years ago, China hasn't spent money on all these wars, et cetera. They have an incredible infrastructure in their country, et cetera, et cetera. The United States, the people of the United States, sometimes they think domestic policy is everything. They don't pay attention much to foreign policy, but then they don't realize that all the money that is spent in the military budget, for example, that would have been used for the people's welfare in the United States, and it's not being used.
Thank you very much. That's great, Coleen. Okay, Your Excellency, we come back to you, Bárbara, for a few final remarks. In particular, whether you think there will be any change between Biden and Trump.
No. I prefer to say the final idea. Is no matter how hard, how difficult the future will be, people like Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, and Cuban, we do not surrender. We have a responsibility, yes, because the life and the future of the humanity is more than the imperialism or than took USA president. We need to fight in many aspects, and because this is a very difficult challenge. We have a responsibility, and we need to do it. We have no the right to surrender, never, in any circumstances.
Thank you very much. That's a very inspiring message to end the meeting this afternoon. So we've taken a lot of your time. It's been very worthwhile for all of us to hear from all of you. So thank you very much indeed. Let me just say this in conclusion. Successive US governments have had the ultimate aim in all three of your nations to bring about regime change, to remove current governments and to install US-backed client states, which would deliver neoliberal economic policies and benefit the US and local elites, of course, and destroy social revolutions and all of your progressive pro-poor policies that have taken place in all of your countries. US sanctions intended to cause suffering and hardship go hand in hand with the US support for opposition groups who promote all of the destabilization that we know about in your countries. Sanctions and blockades are against international law. You've all said that. We've heard it very clearly. It's absolutely the case. And so this is the time when we, outside of your countries, have to put international pressure on the US administration. So everybody on this call needs to hear that message. The pressure has to be, as a number of you said, for diplomacy, for constructive dialogue, for ending sanctions on humanitarian grounds, not the least reason being the COVID pandemic, but just anyway. And we need to continue to stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba, of Nicaragua and Venezuela, and oppose continuing US aggression. So I am delighted to give that message on behalf of those who were on the call to you today. Thank you very much for joining us. Can I just say thank you again to all of our speakers and also for the people who did all the technicals for us. And last but not least, can I please say that it's really important that if any of you are on this call and you are not members of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, the Nicaragua Solidarity Action Group, and you are not a member of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, do not leave your screen until you have become a member. This is a really important message. So hugs to you all. One of these days we will meet again in either Nicaragua or Cuba or Venezuela. And until then, solidarity to you all. Thank you very much for being on the call. We will see you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Well done, Christine. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I did kind of mix up some of the questions, but I think that was all right, wasn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely fine. Well done, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Well, I want to know how many people join as a result of this.
We'll let you know.